Okay, popcorn and snow cone machines are ready. Might as well talk about the book while I wait for everyone else to arrive. Today, we're going over Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice was written by Jane Austen and published in 1813. You might have actually heard of this novel since it's been adapted many times and referenced in a lot of media. In fact, my introduction to this story was through the 1995 BBC miniseries based on the book. It's actually an accurate adaptation of the book, so if you have 6 hours of time on your hands, I'd recommend giving it a watch. Preparing for this review was actually the first time I ever read Pride and Prejudice, which is surprising as many of my younger friends had to read it for school. So, as I mentioned, this book was published in 1813, meaning it was written around that same time, which means that a lot of what I'm about to summarize reflects the customs and standards during that time. Yes, while I didn't have to mention this with other older works I've read, I thought I'd make it clear here since there have been a few adaptations of Pride and Prejudice that put the story in modern times. So if you're familiar with those but not the book, now you know to expect something different. The story begins at the home of the Bennet family. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 unmarried daughters: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, known as Kitty, and Lydia. See, back in those times, women were heavily encouraged to marry young and quickly, mostly because the law at the time said that women couldn't inherit the main property should their father pass. There might have been a few exceptions like you'll see later on, but most of the time, if a man dies without having a son, the property goes to the closest living male relative. And they have the power to drive out the women of the house, leaving them to fend for themselves. I'll go into this more when I talk about Sense and Sensibility. I'm only bringing this up now to help you all understand the pressure that is put onto our main character, Elizabeth Bennet, and why her mom is so insistent on having her daughters get married quickly. So, back to the story. Word is getting around that a young man named Mr. Charles Bingley is renting the manor in Netherfield Park, which is near the village of Longbourn, where the Bennets live. Of course, the first thing on all the girls' minds is if the man is single, and he is. Mr. Bennet pays a social visit to Mr. Bingley, and the Bennets attend a ball where he is present. Mr. Bingley arrives with 2 of his sisters, Miss Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, and his close friend, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Jane, Elizabeth's older sister, is immediately introduced to Mr. Bingley, and the two are instantly smitten with each other. Elizabeth is pleased that her sister is happy, but notices that Mr. Darcy seems to be displeased with everything and everyone in the room. He even refuses to dance with Elizabeth. Meanwhile, Jane and Mr. Bingley are getting closer and closer. Then she's invited to dine with Miss Bingley over at the manor. Now, Mrs. Bennet, in all her wisdom, decides that Jane should go over to the house on horseback, in the rain, where she catches a cold and stays at Mr. Bingley's house until she recovers. Which is a long time. But hey, at least now she's spending more time with Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth wants to go take care of her sister, so she walks all the way to the manor sometime after the storm, which makes her dress all muddy. This does not please Miss Bingley, who already looks down upon the Bennet family. And it doesn't help that Mr. Darcy has been paying attention to Elizabeth, and Miss Bingley was hoping to get with Mr. Darcy, and, he keeps looking at her, and she's like, "Are you serious? Her? And her muddy dress? What's wrong with you?" During Elizabeth's stay at the manor, she and Mr. Darcy get to know each other a little better, although he's not making a very good first impression. Okay, well, he hasn't already, but this is even more so. Jane and Elizabeth finally go home, and sometime later their distant cousin Mr. Collins comes by for a visit. Mr. Collins is the one who will inherit Mr. Bennet's home when he passes away. Now, Mrs. Bennet is hoping one of her daughters will marry Mr. Collins and therefore inherit the property so they still have a comfortable living. Well, Mr. Collins is at first infatuated with Jane, but Mrs. Bennet tells him that it's very likely she'll be getting married soon since Mr. Bingley is still very much head over heels for her. So then Mr. Collins sets his sights on Elizabeth. Now, in some adaptations, it shows that Mary is infatuated with Mr. Collins and keeps trying to get his attention, but he pays her no mind. In the book, it's implied that Mary would marry Mr. Collins if it came down to it. Just a little note I thought I'd put in there. Anyways, during this time, the militia is in town, and the Bennets meet a young soldier named Mr. George Wickham. Elizabeth and Mr. Wickham become friends, but it seems he knows Mr. Darcy. Apparently, Mr. Darcy supposedly cheated Wickham out of an inheritance. See, Mr. Wickham's father was Mr. Darcy's father's steward. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham were actually raised together, and Mr. Darcy's father treated Wickham like his own son. Anyways, with this new information, Elizabeth now has an even worse impression of Mr. Darcy. Well, another ball is coming up, and Elizabeth is hoping Mr. Wickham will come with the other soldiers, but he doesn't come. Now, I freaking love this part, because it's where Mr. Darcy dances with Elizabeth and they start getting to know each other a little better. Now, Elizabeth still doesn't like Mr. Darcy that much, and doesn't even know why she said yes to his offer to dance, but hey, it's better than dancing with Mr. Collins, who she has been trying to avoid. Anyways, later on, Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, but she turns him down. She turns him down rather harshly, too, since he didn't seem to get the point that she didn't love him, and she doubts she will ever make him happy. Well, he leaves Longbourn, and we later find out that he is now engaged to Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte Lucas. Elizabeth does not understand why on earth her best friend of all people would want to be with Mr. Collins. Well, this is the interesting thing that I'll point out a little more in the analysis, but Charlotte tells Elizabeth that she's getting older and needs financial security, which is why she wants to marry Mr. Collins. The two do end up getting married. Elizabeth is willing to be supportive of her friend and wants to visit her in her new home. Now, around the winter, Mr. Bingley and his crew have left Netherfield to return to London, which saddens Jane immensely. So around that time, Jane goes into London to visit with friends and stay with her aunt and uncle. Her plan is that she hopes to run into Mr. Bingley while she's there. Well, it turns out, Miss Bingley visits Jane and quite rudely tells Jane that Mr. Bingley has been seeing Mr. Darcy's little sister, Georgiana. Miss Bingley believes that they will get together. She basically just told Jane politely that she should go home and forget about Mr. Bingley. He hasn't visited Jane during her time in London. And we find out later that's because he had no idea she was in London. Now, while Jane is in London, this is around springtime now, Elizabeth is staying at Mr. Collins' home near Rosings Park, which is the property of his patron, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who also happens to be Mr. Darcy's aunt. Lady Catherine invites the Collinses and Elizabeth over often so that she can get to know Elizabeth. Well, guess who else happens to be here? Mr. Darcy. Since he's in the area, he decides that now is the perfect time to stop by the Collins home to see Elizabeth, and one day, he proposes to her. Well, Elizabeth already has a poor impression of him and has an even worse impression since she believes that he's part of the reason Mr. Bingley hasn't visited Jane. She confronts him about that incident and disinheriting Wickham. She also tells him that he hasn't behaved very kindly to her or her family, and has literally no reason to accept his proposal. I think what was going through his head during that time was, man, she's so pretty, but why? Why do I like her? Well, might as well propose to her. No, that's not how it works. That's never how it works. Now, I know I've said that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy got to know each other a little better, but they don't really interact that much throughout all of their experiences. While Elizabeth stayed at Netherfield, she mostly kept to herself and read or checked on Jane. Any interaction she had with Mr. Darcy was brief, and during the dance, nothing went between them that would imply Mr. Darcy wanting to marry her or she wanting to marry him. Well, Mr. Darcy leaves, but then he writes her a letter explaining himself and the truth about Wickham's situation. Yes, he did separate Mr. Bingley and Jane because he didn't think their romance was serious. Well, he could see that Mr. Bingley was in love with Jane, but he didn't think she was in love with him. See, Jane has a habit of hiding her true feelings, so Mr. Darcy was basically looking out for his friend. But still, he should have at least checked a little better. He did not go about this the right way. As for the Wickham situation, he did confirm that the two were raised together, but Wickham lied to Elizabeth about his situation. The real reason Darcy and Wickham hate each other is because Wickham tried to elope with Georgiana, who has a large dowry. Wickham really only wanted her for her money. Thankfully, Mr. Darcy was able to stop them in time. Elizabeth is reevaluating her feelings toward Mr. Darcy. She is debating whether or not to believe him, but he seemed very sincere. Once she returns home, she's a bit more cold toward Mr. Wickham and watches him closely as they interact. Elizabeth does manage to catch a hint of his true nature, but decides to keep it to herself. Okay, well, not entirely to herself. She does tell Jane, but Jane agrees to keep it to herself. Elizabeth keeps the whole situation to herself because she understands why Mr. Darcy wanted to keep this covered up. He doesn't want his sister to be disgraced. Well, the militia is leaving for Brighton, which saddens Kitty and Lydia. However, Lydia is invited to go with the militia to Brighton as a companion to the colonel's wife, Harriet Forster. It takes some convincing, but Lydia does get permission to go. Now, later in the year, with the arrival of summer, Elizabeth spends some time with her aunt and Uncle Gardner. They end up spending some time north near Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's estate. They are allowed by the housekeeper to look at the house since it is quite a grand place, and it seems Mr. Darcy isn't home. Elizabeth is fascinated by the house and all the area around it. The housekeeper continuously praises Mr. Darcy as a good man. Elizabeth is now starting to have a different idea of what Mr. Darcy is really like. Well, it seems Mr. Darcy has come home early. Elizabeth is shocked to find him home so soon. It seems Mr. Darcy is used to people coming by to look at his house since, again, it's a large property and the house is quite nice. Plus, the housekeeper said it was okay. Anyways, here's the thing. Mr. Darcy is behaving a lot nicer to Elizabeth than he had in the past. This is shocking to Elizabeth, but she remains polite to him. Mr. Darcy is polite to the Gardners and says he would like Elizabeth to meet his sister. Now, Elizabeth does end up meeting Georgiana, and she holds Elizabeth in very high regard. They plan to meet up again some other time, but Elizabeth gets 2 letters from Jane that were accidentally sent to another house. So these letters were a bit old. Anyways, Jane tells Elizabeth that Lydia and Mr. Wickham had planned to elope in Scotland, but they're not in Scotland. Which could imply that the two are living together out of wedlock, which could very well ruin not just Lydia's reputation, but the reputation of the Bennet family. Elizabeth is beyond worried and isn't sure why Wickham would aim for Lydia, since Lydia doesn't have any money or connections, which further confirms the suspicion that Wickham likely has no intention to marry Lydia. Elizabeth is preparing to go tell her uncle about all this, but runs into Mr. Darcy, who had stopped by to see her. He sends a servant to go get Mr. Gardner and tries his best to console Elizabeth. She ends up telling him what she just heard and blames herself for not telling anyone about Wickham's true behavior earlier. Elizabeth goes home with her aunt and uncle. Mr. Gardner goes out to help Mr. Bennet look for Lydia and Wickham. Mr. Bennet ends up returning back home empty-handed. Everyone is freaking out. But eventually, a letter comes from Mr. Gardner explaining that the couple have been found and Wickham has agreed to marry Lydia in exchange for an annual income. But see, the income is a lot less than they all thought, since Wickham had a lot of debts due to a gambling addiction. They believe that Mr. Gardner paid off all of Wickham's debts. Lydia and Wickham eventually come to Longbourn to visit. Lydia lets slip that Mr. Darcy was at their wedding. Elizabeth, being curious as to why he would be there, she writes a letter to her Aunt Gardner asking about it. Mrs. Gardner writes a letter back explaining that Mr. Darcy was the one who found Wickham and Lydia, and the one who paid off Wickham's debts. Lydia and Wickham later leave north where Wickham's assignment is. Well, things have calmed down a bit after all that, but it seems Mr. Bingley has returned to Netherfield, and Mr. Darcy is with him as well. Both of them come by to visit often, until one day, Mr. Bingley comes alone. And that's when he proposes to Jane. Mr. Bingley and Jane are set to be married soon, and everyone is excited. And well, it seems Lady Catherine de Bourgh has come to Longbourn to yell at Elizabeth for marrying Mr. Darcy. Well, see, here's the thing. Mr. Darcy hasn't made a move on Elizabeth since her rejection of his proposal. Way back, months ago. He's only been acting nicely to her. Now, the reason Lady Catherine disapproves of Elizabeth marrying Mr. Darcy is because she wants him to marry her daughter Anne and unite the two estates of Rosings and Pemberley. Lady Catherine tells Elizabeth not to marry Mr. Darcy, and if he asks, to refuse him. Elizabeth tells her that she isn't engaged to Mr. Darcy and will make no such promise of rejecting him. Lady Catherine eventually leaves, and Elizabeth doesn't tell anyone the real reason she came by. Later on, Mr. Darcy comes by for a visit, and while out walking with Elizabeth, she expresses her gratitude for everything he's done for her and her family. He admits that he is still in love with Elizabeth and asks her once again if she'd marry him, saying that if her feelings hadn't changed, he'd drop the subject altogether, never bring it up again. Well, Elizabeth's feelings for him have changed. She loves him and all he's done for her, and how he's currently treating her. Now, some adaptations don't include this part from the book, but there's one scene after this whole experience where Mr. Darcy goes to get Mr. Bennet's approval so that he may marry Elizabeth. Mr. Bennet asks Elizabeth if this is what she really wants, since she's expressed her hatred of Mr. Darcy in the past. Elizabeth explains that this is really what she wants, and explains how much Mr. Darcy has done for them, and her gradual process of falling in love with him. Mr. Bennet understands and approves of the marriage. And Jane and Mr. Bingley get married, Then Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy get married. We then get a little epilogue of stuff that happened afterwards. Miss Bingley was not pleased that Jane got with her brother, and was even less pleased that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy got together. Georgiana and Elizabeth are really good friends now, which is what Mr. Darcy was hoping for. And they all lived happily ever after. Let's analyze, shall we? First of all, the main subject you could look at instantly is the gradual falling in love process and the change in behavior. Elizabeth, as she got to know Mr. Darcy, started to fall in love with him since he wasn't as bad as she originally thought. Although Mr. Darcy didn't treat Elizabeth right at first, he later learned the hard way that he should treat her a little better and come to treat her family with respect as well. Just that gradual process was very pleasing to see, and it's what makes the story a fun ride. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy complement each other. There's actually one part near the end where Miss Bingley is reminding Mr. Darcy that he didn't originally see her as that pretty, but he says that that was in the past when he first met her. But now, as he's gotten to know her much better, he sees her as one of the handsomest women in his acquaintance. Now, let's talk about Jane and Elizabeth. Jane has a tendency to see everyone and everything in a very positive light. She even tells Elizabeth that she wouldn't believe Miss Bingley to be so mean as to separate her from Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth, however, sees what she believes to be their true nature. She sees things a bit more negatively or realistically than Jane. Elizabeth has had to help Jane understand the evils of the world, while Jane helps Elizabeth understand that there is good in everyone. Now, Mrs. Bennet is an interesting character. She only wants what's best for her daughters, but she doesn't really have much regard to their happiness. This is shown especially in the scene right after Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet says Elizabeth is, and I quote, "a very headstrong, foolish girl, and does not know her own interest, but I will make her know it." I'm just gonna let that sink in for a minute. Again, heart is in the right place, but she's going about it the wrong way. Back then, yes, it's important for a woman to marry and have a comfortable life, but Elizabeth wants to be happy in her marriage. See, now compare this to Mr. Bennet, who also wants his daughters to live comfortable lives, but he understands the importance of their happiness. That's why Mr. Bennet asks Elizabeth if marrying Mr. Darcy is really what she wants. He's there to make sure she's not being forced into the marriage or only doing it for the sake of money, since Mr. Darcy is very wealthy. Now, I want to discuss Charlotte and Elizabeth for a bit. There are several conversations throughout the book where Elizabeth and Charlotte talk about love life and stuff like that. Elizabeth wants to marry for love, while Charlotte would simply be happy marrying anyone as long as she lives comfortably, which is why she marries Mr. Collins. Later in the book, as we see Mr. Collins and Charlotte's interactions with each other, Charlotte is happy with him. While yes, she did marry him for financial security, she did grow to love him over time. I could honestly go on for hours about each of these characters and the plot itself, but in short, we get a large variety of themes that could work great for an amazing paper. Plus, it's a cute love story that makes me extremely happy. Overall, the story is very well written, it's a fun ride, a cute romance, and you get a good look at how things were back in the day. I recommend this book for ages 15 and up. The language is a little hard to understand, but it is very much worth reading. Like I said, there have been many adaptations of Pride and Prejudice. Recently, I saw a stage production of Pride and Prejudice that was very well done. It was very fun to watch. My favorite adaptation is still the 1995 BBC miniseries, since I believe that to be the most accurate to the book, although it is 6 hours long total. However, if you want something that's shorter, the 2005 movie was also very well done and a fun watch, but since it is 2 hours, a lot of stuff was changed or cut. But it's still a pretty decent adaptation. I'd actually recommend watching either the miniseries or the movie first before reading the book so you get a good grasp on what's going on because, again, the language is difficult to understand. Pride and Prejudice is still one of my favorite love stories, and I love watching the miniseries. I understand why some of you may find it boring, but personally, I think it's worth your time. I hope you enjoyed listening to me gush about this wonderful story. Happy reading!